welcome back to Closet Meets Career. I am here with Steve Schwartz, who is our LSAT guru. So I'll let you take it from here, Steve.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, Anna. Pleasure to be connecting with you. So for folks who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I run the LSAT blog. I also host the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. I've been teaching the LSAT for about 15 years now. My journey started when I took a cold diagnostic and got a 152, which was pretty discouraging for me because I wanted to go to a top 14 law school. And over a very arduous and difficult year, I gradually brought my score up to a 175 on test day.
Okay, Steve.
Yeah, so that's my journey, but just the start of it. And yeah, thanks. And since then, I've been teaching the LSAT ever since. Never ended up going to law school, got really obsessed with this exam, and I've been teaching it ever since.
Really? Wow. That is amazing. That's dedication too. That's awesome. I only know one other person like that, and she was like that for the bar. She took the bar. I think she passed it, but I don't think she passed it by as much as she wanted to, which for me, I'm just like, thank you, Jesus. And then she ended up teaching the bar different courses, and she started taking different bar exams for fun, so much so that my understanding is that she is no longer allowed to take certain bars in certain jurisdictions because she just has it, so. But yeah, okay. So let's get started. So what do you want to jump into first?
So one thing we could talk about, I'm sure your audience is pretty interested in, probably is the digital LSAT transition that just happened last year. So we could get into that a bit, because I imagine when you took it, it was paper and pencil, right?
Yes. Which I don't know if that makes me seem old or if it's like that's just the natural progression of things.
I kind of feel the same way because I took it paper and pencil also. But I'm thinking like 10, 20 years from now, I'll still be teaching the LSAT and people won't even be able to fathom the idea of taking a paper and pencil LSAT where you could miss bubble, where there could be Scantron issues, carrying around number 2 pencils that break. It's crazy, but LSAC is late to the game, but they finally done it and they even jumped ahead from over desktop going straight to a tablet.
You can take the LSAT on a tablet?
It's only on a tablet now. Yeah, in North America. So it's still paper and pencil overseas, but in North America, it's only on a tablet.
The more you know.
Right.
So glad we're doing.
I know. And if they wanted to be really cool about it, they could have put it on an iPad, but instead, of course, they chose Microsoft Surface Go.
Probably because licensing. Apple is so hard to get into. Then they probably would have had only Apple LSAT and then, created a situation. But wow, but what if you accidentally click the wrong, I know they tell you to review, but I'm a paper and pencil kind of person.
Yeah, I totally hear you. And I am also, so I don't love the transition. Again, we're dating ourselves here, but yeah. I think that with the Microsoft thing, that part of that might've been just that Microsoft is good with businesses and bureaucracies. So they kind of gave them some volume licensing deal, I would imagine. But to your question, if you misbubble something, you can easily change it.
Okay,
great. And there's a navigation bar at the bottom, so you can see all the questions that you completed, which ones you bubbled. And there's a cool flagging feature, so you can flag questions to come back to later. They've thought of everything.
Okay. I am not mad at that because I also saw that they now have a lot of the application process digitized too, specifically with the credential assembly service, and the pricing is very interesting to me because and again, maybe this is dating myself, but when I was applying, it was like, I'll apply to all these schools, let LSAC know what schools I'm applying to, and then they just send the packet over. And now it's like, well, just tell us, put everything in this drag and drop, and then we'll send it out. Let us know how many schools you want us to send it to, pay however many schools. I believe it's close to $700 for 6 and close to $400 for 1. And I'm just like, I am old. I'm old.
Yeah, I also, even back when I was applying to college, they were just starting to do online college applications. And I was like, I don't trust it. It's going to get lost. I'm going to do paper. But now it's like, I don't even think that you could apply with paper anymore.
They can't. I think they were just phasing that out when I was applying to law school. It was like either you had to apply online or you had to pay more to apply with paper. And I was just like, I have to pay to apply with paper and I'm already mailing it,
Yeah, I guess it's just whatever's easiest for them at the end of the day, right? LSAC really does exist to serve law schools rather than law school applicants. They consider law schools the client. And if you look at it from that perspective, that kind of explains why they're not always the most student friendly with a lot of
Yep.
things.
Yep. I completely agree. The Law School Admissions Council, so many warm and fuzzy thoughts.
Yeah, it really is. So, I mean, it is digital, and LSAC is trying to help applicants. I mean, one of the biggest things they've done that I love is they put 3 LSATs in the digital LSAT format on their site at familiar.lsac.org. So you can use them on a tablet or a computer or even a mobile phone. I don't recommend phone, though it doesn't work that well. But on a tablet and computer, you can really see what the features are. Like I mentioned the flagging function, the navigation bar. You can bubble in with one tap of the stylus or your finger, and there's a countdown timer. So there's no more ambiguity around proctors potentially screwing up the time, which is really nice.
Oh, no, I'm not familiar exactly with the whole digitizing of this. So is there also a timer between questions? Is that something that they can make use of? Because I remember like you just kind of have to look at the clock and time yourself and kind of guess where you are. But is that something that's a new feature?
Well, the only thing they're having with the countdown timer is it counts down from 35 minutes for each section. So it's not game by game or passage by passage or question by question, but I actually think that's a good thing because not all questions are of equal difficulty on the LSAT. So I wouldn't want you to try and hold yourself to 8:45 per game. I'd rather you just look at the countdown timer and kind of gauge where you're at. And hopefully by test day, you've done enough practice tests that you can have your own internal rhythm for the pacing.
Yes, exactly. In practice tests, now that you mentioned that, like, and I don't know if we're segueing into a new topic, but for any stage in your legal journey, whether it's LSAT, law school, taking the bar, practice, 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 and I cannot overstate the importance of practicing, just being able to test yourself, test your theories, applications, everything. And like you mentioned, my story is similar to yours, my LSAT journey, where the first time I took it, I got, I think I got like a 147, and I was just beside myself. And I was like, oh my God, like and you have to understand that when you're a person who's used to getting good grades and you think you're so smart and like all this stuff, and then you get something that's beneath what you feel like your quality is, it was very hard for me. And so the biggest difference between me studying the first time and the biggest difference between me studying the second time was, one, the amount of time I put into it, two, the amount of time that I tested myself, even being section by section, because my strongest section was reading comprehension, and funny enough, it still is. And then my weaker sections were logical reasoning, and what's the other one? Analytical reasoning. And so I found those to be very challenging, but again, like you mentioned, with practice, you can definitely get better and improve your score. And also taking more full-length exams. And I don't think a lot of students do that because, one, they don't see the value in taking up a day, like 3 hours or what have you, to practice the exam, but it's so necessary. Like even taking the bar, you have to do it one time. You just have to. You cannot, in my opinion, get a good score without practicing, unless you're like super genius. Some people don't, and they have great scores, but like, the rest of us that are just like barely hanging on, like you have to, it's necessary.
Yeah, those people, they're so frustrating, but they're also really rare. I think most people, they take a cold diagnostic like you and I, and they bomb it compared to where they ultimately wanted to be, right? And so I actually don't recommend taking those cold diagnostics because they're just morale killers. Then they're discouraging. I mean, they simply tell you that you haven't studied the LSAT yet, but you already know that. You still got to learn pretty much everything, especially the analytical reasoning, the logic games. Those are so intimidating for people at first, myself included. I mean, pre-law folks, how comfortable are you with things like math and puzzles, right? It doesn't always come that naturally.
I'm like, why does this even matter? That was my whole thought. I'm like, why does this even matter? Like, who honestly cares?
Right. But the thing is that they are actually really learnable. And so if you just trust that, you know what, this is really hard at the beginning, it sucks, but if you keep at it, you will improve significantly, especially on games. I mean, the fact that you were already good at reading comp is awesome because that's a lot harder to improve significantly on than games is. I also love what you said about the practice test because I wouldn't do a cold diagnostic, but I would do a lot of exams once you've already built the foundation in the lead up to test day. I recommend at least 10 to really get that rhythm down with the pacing and the endurance.
I agree with that. I agree with that. And one other study tip, and I guess it's personal and it just kind of depends on how you study. And actually, before I get into what I'm getting ready to say, how you learn yourself is so important because there is so much information out there to try to help you figure out how to study. And they're like, oh, if you do this and you do that and you watch these videos and you download this app and you do all of these things. For myself, and I really learned this more in law school, I'm a person who studies better by myself. And not that I don't benefit from group study, but it's just really hard for me to learn like that, as opposed to some people, they benefit from a class environment. The first time I studied for the LSAT, I took Kaplan, which was a class. Myself and my other classmates got to participate and discuss, but when other people were discussing things, I found it, going over my head, as opposed to when I'm sitting down and I have to force myself to touch every single question. So I think that that's really important. But the other point I was going to make is that I think there is so much value in putting a certain amount of time in there, because even if you feel like you're not progressing, like just spending 2 hours on a subject, let's just say per session that you study, even if your wheels aren't turning the way that you want them to turn, you will pick something up in that process. And sometimes it just takes time for something to click for you. But you won't know that unless you actually sit down and put in that time. And I know that in college, I don't want to say college is kind of easy, but depending on what kind of school you go to, but a lot of students are not used to having to study every single day for a certain amount of time, to reach an ultimate end goal. And I find that knowing how to study is a part of the disconnect in between the score that you may start off with when in a code diagnostic, like you mentioned, and the score that you ultimately end up with. And some students, the wise students, have the foresight to be able to really break down the subjects and be able to test themselves and spend time with the subject. And that can be kind of tricky. Like for myself, I didn't really, I was a crammer, do things last minute, and going from that to I have a regimented study schedule where I have to do X amount of time per day. I'm doing 1 to 2 practice tests per day, or even if it's not a test, just a section, 25 questions here, 35 questions there every other day. Really just setting up a schedule for yourself, I think, is one of the most important things you can do in conjunction with really understanding who you are and how you study.
Yeah, I could not agree more with that. I think the LSAT, because it's so much more difficult than anything most applicants have encountered up to that point, it's really important to slow down and figure out a plan of attack so you're not just spinning your wheels.
Exactly.
Like we said, cold diagnostics may not really tell you that much other than that you haven't gotten there yet. Exactly. But you got to figure out what's going to work best for you. Some people learn best in a classroom setting. Some learn best with a tutor or a coach. Some learn best with a study group. Some learn best alone, just hitting the books or watching on-demand videos. Different styles for different people. And so if one way isn't working for you, that doesn't mean you have to give up. It means you have to try a different approach or ask yourself whether you've really been giving it your all, especially for those who are working or in school, have a ton of other obligations. If you're going to class when you're exhausted, you may not be getting the most out of it, but that's not really anybody's fault. You just have to change your schedule up a little bit.
Exactly. I could not agree with you more than that. That hits just so close to home, like really making sure that you have time for things. Because at the time that I was studying for my LSAT, I played volleyball in college. And so I was really trying to do a lot, at the same time. And it really was not reflecting, again, like you mentioned, the way that I wanted it to, but also it wasn't anybody's fault. I just did not have the time to commit to that. So I had to just buckle down the second time and be like, I'm not going to do X so that I can, study.
Yeah, you've got a lot of competing obligations and you really have to block out the time. And one of the first things I did back when I started teaching this exam was to establish day-by-day study plans so that you know exactly what to be doing every single day over the course of your prep.
Okay. And so all my followers should check out your study plans. I love that.
Definitely. Yeah. So they're day-by-day LSAT study schedules, and they're for all different timelines, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, and so on, whenever you're taking the LSAT.
You have thought of it all. I love it.
Well, it was really based on what people were asking me for. I put out free week-by-week ones initially, but people wanted even more detail. And I was like, just divide by 7. But people really wanted the specificity. And so the schedules are actually more important for the specificity about what to do than the actual day-by-day breakdown. But the framework is you build the foundation first, then you work on pacing with individual sections, then you finally bring it all together with those full-length exams so that you're not giving yourself any one part of it too early. You're meeting yourself exactly where you're at, but also challenging yourself a little bit too.
Exactly. Now, you mentioned that you have a 1-month study program. Tell me how that works, because in my experience, people who start 1 month out usually don't score as high. And not saying that they can't, but I just know that because the exam is so time intensive, and like you mentioned, probably one of the more time intensive things that you've had to do up until that point, what does the 1 month schedule look like? And is it really possible? Tell us some more stories.
Oh, that's a good question. So I was kind of conflicted about creating that because the thing is that, as you said, it's not really enough time. And I would totally agree with that, what you were implying there. I recommend minimum 3 months, but ideally 5 to 6 months to reach your fullest potential on the exam, because it is worth devoting that amount of time given how important it is to the law school admission process.
Exactly.
So, but that being said, some people, they only want to devote 1 month to it. They only can devote 1 month to it. And so if you were starting from scratch and only had 1 month, obviously you've got to put in a ton of time. You may not achieve your fullest potential, but basically it's kind of like my 3-month plan, but compressed and removing some of the work because you can't do it all. But I would definitely not recommend trying to do it while you have other obligations. If you're doing it all in 1 month, I'd say you're not working, you're not in school, you're doing nothing but LSAT, but you also don't want to do too much and run the risk of burning out. But the framework is always the same. It's foundation, sections, exams.
Very cool. Very cool. I love that. So also we have teed up is LSAT prep mistakes. And I'll let you lead off on this, especially just because you have your plans and, study tips already laid out for people to visit and download and review.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a couple of big mistakes. One of them is taking the cold diagnostic and then getting discouraged and giving up, or just taking exam after exam after exam and measuring yourself obsessively. I actually call this the obsessive practice exam narrative, because people get obsessed with taking exams every single day, hoping that alone will improve their scores. And they kind of track it with spreadsheets and look for hidden patterns, when in reality, people do that. Yeah, there's tons of spreadsheets out there and frameworks for this. People go nuts.
Wow. Oh no, I would not recommend that at all. Like at all.
I mean, think about it. Type A law students, they want to do it all. There's nearly 100 exams. They're numbered. It just lends itself to that obsessiveness in there. It's like you do one by one. But the problem is that you're not reviewing your mistakes. You're not learning anything from them.
Exactly.
So you got to slow down and take fewer exams and review them in more depth to figure out where your mistakes are coming from.
Exactly. Another thing that I would add to that is, I think one common mistake that I notice of law students is that, potential law students or applicants, is that they don't pin down what they're having trouble with. And so I find the easiest way to do that is testing yourself by subject matter. And if you're going to be obsessive like that, take 3 of those types of tests so you can see and identify, I'm not good at questions that ask me things like this, but I am good at questions that ask me things like this. So being able to narrow down exactly what you're bad at. And like you pointed out, let's just say in your practice test, your fake test, you get a 150 and the next time you get a 152. Well, that doesn't tell you that you are suffering in reading comprehension, and maybe you improved the next time, but you regressed in another area. And so I think a lot of people should really focus on their strengths and devoting more time to their weaknesses. Because I also think that law students have a tendency to continue to practice things that they're good at to try to make themselves feel better about the test. Well, if I just get all the reading comprehension questions right, then I can afford to take off on some logical reasoning or analytical reasoning. And I think that is a fundamentally flawed way to look at the exam, because at the end of the day, you're not I mean, I don't want to say you won't, but it's very unlikely that you will get all the questions of every section correct, even if that is your best section. So do you have anything?
Yeah, that's such a good point. I think that that's part of why having a plan is so important, because if you don't have a plan, then you're going based on emotions and how you're feeling that day. And you're like, you know what? Some people, I'll hear from people all the time who are like, I love logic games. I've really come around on those. So I haven't touched reading comp in weeks, even though I kind of know that reading comp's where I have to focus.
Oh, because it's also like, oh, like I'm scared because I don't want to take it and then mess up and then uh it was not a fun process.
No, no, it's not. But then
Not
it's like,
fun.
but the funny thing is that people will keep doing logic games because it feels good. And it's like, well, it is still LSAT. So I am still studying,
Right.
but it may not get you the results that you truly need. If reading comp is where you're struggling, maybe you've got to focus there primarily.
Exactly. I think one big section that I don't want to say that we're leaving out that we haven't gotten to yet is the writing, because the writing is unscored. So a lot of students tend not to focus on the writing part of it. But the writing part is so important because when it comes down to, let's say you, Steve, and I get the same score, let's just say we both get a 150. What is going to differentiate us from a law school's perspective from one another? And they're going to look at how well do you write? Is this clear? Is this articulate? Is this well reasoned? Is this misspelled? Does it flow? Does it argue a certain point? Does it actually answer the question that we asked? And students tend not to practice their writing because they're like, oh, I write all the time. I know how to do this. I'm just going to go in there and wing it and it's going to be great. But also, and this may not be for every school, but I know that schools really consider even merit-based scholarships based on the writing sample, and that might be the weight that gets you teetering over one edge of acceptance or not acceptance, or scholarship versus non-scholarship, and it's something that you don't pay attention to because it doesn't fit into the raw score. So I think that writing is a very important place to start, especially because in law school, writing is your bread and butter. Like the logic games and everything like that, they matter, and it matters to get you in the door, but the writing is what's going to sustain you through law school and ultimately through your career. So I think that to only focus on the standardized testing aspect of it is a big mistake.
Yeah, I agree. I think that everything you just said about the writing sample, I would also apply to the personal statement as well.
Agreed.
And the writing sample for the LSAT has actually become more important than ever before because it is now digital also.
So you also have to know how to type and be able to type.
Yeah, so it's crazy, all these changes, but it's actually no longer administered on test day itself. It's now done from your own personal computer. You have up to 1 year to complete it after the LSAT.
The writing sample?
Yeah, you're not doing it at the test center anymore.
It doesn't seem fair. It doesn't even seem fair anymore.
I know what you mean, but on the plus side though, I mean, there have been some digital LSAT tech issues, so at least you've avoided those.
Well, I do feel a little better now.
But yeah, that writing sample, I mean, especially if you're a non-native English speaker or if your English related grades in college weren't that great, the writing sample is your chance to show that you are articulate, fully fluent, and that you can write well.
Exactly.
And there's spell check. There's spell check on it too.
Oh yeah, no, this is definitely cheating. No. That's like definitely cheating.
Yeah.
So next we have to discuss is LSAT cancellations and retakes. So, and I touched on this in my last video, my position on this is retake at your own risk. And I say that because what I found in my research is that some schools apply a holistic view where they just kind of spread all of your scores out and say, okay, we kind of have a feel for where this person is scoring. Some people average all of the scores together for better or for worse. Some schools only take the highest score. So depending on whatever school it is that you're trying to get into, it's really important to know how they're going to score you. And then at the same time, I think the money part is a really huge part of it, because if you don't have, X amount of dollars to plop down for this test the first time, your score may not go up unless you change something dramatically from the first time you studied to the second time that you studied. And how happy will you be if you ultimately get the same score, and you studied again and you spent all this time and money. But like you mentioned, for myself, retaking it was my blessing, because what ultimately ended up happening for me was that I was able to get a few scholarships to different schools that I know that I would not have been able to get with my last score. So it just kind of depends, rolling the dice. But say all that to say, I think that if you plan to retake it, you should plan to change something significantly from something you did study wise from the first time to the second time. And if you aren't planning to put in more time, put in more work, and really take that effort more seriously, I don't think it's worth it. But if you are willing to do that, then I think that it can be worth it.
I would definitely agree with the last thing you said about changing your approach, putting in the time for a retake. I have a slightly different take on the first part of what you said, though,
Okay.
because in my discussions with law schools and just my research on this, law schools do not average multiple scores. They
Okay.
only take the highest, with the exception of maybe a few Canadian law schools, but pretty much every law school in the United States takes the highest score. Of course, they can see them all, and it's better to have just like a 170 rather than a 150 followed by a 170. But
Mhm.
since they're not averaging, because of the US News rankings only requiring the highest for the American Bar Association,
Okay,
then
that's great. Now that must be a big change, because when I took, and again, now I'm old now,
dating ourselves
but
again, right?
but that's a huge change. So that's great. So that actually works in the favor of the law students. And
Exactly. It's amazing. And this change,
okay,
the funny thing is that law schools still kind of spread this misinformation around this because they like the idea of holistic review. It sounds really nice. It sounds
I
more,
see.
maybe more fair in some ways, but
Okay,
really the facts are that law schools submit the highest LSAT score of their matriculating students to the American Bar Association, who in
got
turn provides that info to US News. And admissions is all about the US News rankings. So
Oh yeah, yeah, I know. I am very familiar with the ranking system. Well, it makes sense though, if the schools are trying to improve their own rankings, that they would only take the highest score, because they're like, oh, all of our applicants have this average score of
right.
X. Yeah.
Right. So the funny thing then is that, like, if you took the LSAT, let's say that your aptitude and your practice test average was a 160, and then you got a 160 on test day. You could say, well, I scored where I should have, I'm done. Or you could say there is a margin of error or a score band of 3.5 points on either end. So one day you might get a 157, one day you might get a 163 or 164, and the
Got
LSAT's still perfectly valid. But by retaking, through luck alone, you could do 3 to 4 points better. And a 163, 164 obviously opens far more doors, gets you more scholarships than a 160 would. And you might go down too, but if you did, no big deal,
because
because
you
they
still have
only
your
take
high
the
score.
highest. And then
Awesome.
if you studied even more for your retake, which you should, then you could do even better than that. So I say there's not really a reason to take it only once unless you scored at the highest end of your potential and you didn't have time or the time to study or the time to take it again.
Or the money, because that can be like the huge part of it, because it's like,
I hear what you said on the money, and the cost of the LSAT has risen a lot more than inflation has. It's up to $200 now, and I think it was like 150 not that long ago.
and
So
$15 for the writing section, which I was just like, why?
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 Yeah, so I'm definitely understanding of the fact that it costs money to take the LSAT and register for it, and you've given LSAC so much money in all the various fees. But by one calculation, the value of a single point more on the LSAT is $4,000 because of scholarship money, getting to better schools, and at that point now, the average applicant is in their 20s. If you
Oh,
look at how that changes over the course of your entire career, like the $4,000 that you get now at age, let's say 25, look at like 30, 40
listen,
years.
as a person who is very new to paying back all of these loans, I 100% agree. Because just like you mentioned, over time, that cost will compound plus interest, because a lot of people don't know this, but the interest accrues while you're in law school. Definitely not fun. So even if you think you're taking out a $40,000 loan, it might really be 50 on the other side of you taking out that loan. And you're right. So a $200 change in score plus or minus 3 points, if it can dramatically impact you like that, that would be awesome.
Yeah, so it's definitely worth retaking if you think you could do even 1 point better. And I know it's $200 to take it and time is involved in studying, but if you qualify, you could also get a fee waiver to take the
Yes,
LSAT for free.
exactly. Yep, yep, yep. Very true, very true. And I always recommend people to check out fee waivers, even if they feel that their families don't make enough or make too much for the fee waivers, just because you just never know. I, I'm not exactly familiar with how they calculate who is eligible for a fee waiver, but I didn't think I was eligible for fee waivers at the time that I was taking it, and I was. And at that time, it wasn't applied to LSAC; it was applied to me actually applying to the different schools. So I encourage anybody who is wanting to take the LSAT to look into fee waivers, regardless of whatever family income, because the worst they can tell you is no. You know?
Of course. And you can also get fee waivers not only for taking the LSAT from LSAC, but also application fee waivers from law schools.
Yep, exactly. Yep. And
All you have to do is ask, even especially if you go to an LSAC law school forum or you contact them, they hand those out like candy sometimes. It's crazy, but you're saving $100 here, $100 there. It's awesome.
Listen, Steve, you are a lifesaver to so many people, because I think that this information is so helpful, especially when you're scared. I just remember being a law school applicant and just like, oh, there's so many things, like, I don't know where to go. And then, like you mentioned, now the great thing is that everything is digitized. But at that time, I felt like I was clicking all through the website trying to figure out what I didn't know. You know, you have to have these letters of recommendation and they have to be submitted through the secure site. And there was like a whole song and dance about even just applying. So anybody who follows me, make sure you follow Steve and get on his channel, and make sure you check out his study plans and other materials that can definitely be helpful. So the next thing we have teed up is final week test day prep. So you want to take the lead on that?
Yeah, totally. And I think that in that final week, students are often stressed out. They're tending towards doing too much. My rule for this in general in those final months is max 2 tests per week, minimum 2 hours reviewing each test. So don't try to cram it all in. I know we both have that cramming tendency, but less is more. You can't memorize this stuff. At that point, you really either know it or you don't. And it's about walking into test day feeling good. So if your first exam that week goes really well, maybe you don't need to do a second one and end on a high note. Do a little bit of light review, rest the day before, just walk in and kill it.
Mm-hmm. I can't overstate the importance of resting the day before. Even though it's hard, and, you know, everybody gets jittery and you're nervous, and you're like, oh my God, I have it tomorrow. I'm like, I don't know what to eat. I don't want to eat anything that's going to upset my stomach. Like, you know, just taking the time to relax and recharge, because you will still feel all of those jitters on test day. So it's just better to try to get yourself at a level mental space before you sit down and take the test. And I think, like myself and a lot of other test takers will find, just in general, that the initial shock will come once you sit down, and then the proctor's like, okay, go, and then your timer starts going. But once you get into it, if you put in the time and the work, like we've mentioned, you will find that you just kind of fall into a rhythm, because you know what you're doing and how to do it, and you've practiced it so many times.
Exactly. And that's why doing a handful of full-length timed exams before test day makes it so that test day itself is like just another run through, where you have all your pacing down, you have your endurance, kind of like if you were training for a marathon, you've done several long runs already in the months leading up, so that it's not really that different. And at that point, it's all just mental, but because you've done it before, you know you can do it again.
Exactly. So let's see, what do we have here next? Scholarships. And we kind of touched on this a little bit just over the course of our discussion. But scholarships are super important. A huge misconception that a lot of law students express to me is that they don't feel like they can get scholarships, or there's no scholarships for law school. And that is the furthest thing from the truth. Like I mentioned earlier, there are scholarships that they usually have on the website that they promote because they want to attract a certain type of candidate with the money. But a lot of these schools, and I would say the overwhelming majority, have merit-based scholarships. And that's when intangibles like community service, family background, other things like that, different types of involvement, campus involvement, organization, leadership skills, writing ability, all personal statements, like you mentioned, all all of those things come into play. And like you mentioned, if schools want to say they are a holistic applicant type of school, they look at these and say, okay, I think Anna's a really great candidate. Yeah, she has these grades, and maybe that's equivalent to a B plus, and then maybe her LSAT is like, okay, but look at all these great things she's doing. We would like to have this person as an alumni from here, because if she continues on the track record that it looks like she's going on, we can say, oh, this is our alumni, like, this great person. Because I find that people who are type A and are doing a lot of things to try to put themselves in the best position are usually good people that do other things outside of just studying and whatnot. And schools look at that too. And so I would encourage students who are in college to get involved, in addition to doing the writing and the test and the practice, because and you kind of have to do this before you go to law school to build yourself up to that, or excuse me, before you take the LSAT, to build yourself up to that point. But I would definitely encourage students to do that. And not only that, you will find your personal statement will be a lot more interesting with various experiences. And I can't even say how many schools try to commit themselves to diversity by relying on these personal statements and the expressed experiences of these students. So just because the school website only says that they offer a certain amount of scholarships does not mean that you should not apply because you don't think you'll get the money. You should apply anyway and see, because I got, when I was applying to law school, about 7 full tuition scholarships. And at that time, I didn't think my grades were even good enough to get into certain schools. And so that's why I just want to state, like, law school can be on average $150,000. And if somebody is, wiping out $90,000 or $100,000 of that, based on you just being yourself and being involved and engaged, that can be a really important tool to, one, prevent you from playing money, but also in shaping the decision of what law schools you want to go to.
Totally. I'm really glad that you brought up those soft factors, because they do make a difference. Of course, it is primarily numbers driven with LSAT, then GPA, then everything else. But I think people often underestimate that law school admission officers, they're actually people. And I never really understood that until I started doing this for a living, because I also pictured them like they were faceless, anonymous bureaucrats who
like stamping the,
they hold the keys to the kingdom. They're stamping yes, no, reject, accept. But in reality, they're human beings. And the funny thing is that you can actually get to know them. You can call them up and say, could I chat for 10, 15 minutes with you to ask some questions, learn more about it? Oh, how did you get to this law school? What do you like? What don't you like, etc. And then if you can share your hobbies, your interests, your experiences, you never know. You could get lucky. If you write your personal statement about baking and they love baking too, by luck, bam, that's it. Oh, I like this person. You're in. Okay. Like, they do have a little bit of wiggle room for certain people, especially after seat deposit deadlines during the cycle. Some people don't deposit. They have all these slots open now. And if you've gotten to know them and you follow up, like maybe once a month or so, then you're top of mind for them when they have those slots available. And they say, this person's numbers are a little bit low, but they really impressed me with their charisma, their personality. We have this shared common interest. Seem like a nice person. Would love to have him here. Yeah, sure. That really does make a difference.
Yes, it does. And one thing, and I know this is kind of off the topic of the scholarships and the soft factors, but another thing that schools do that they don't often advertise is sometimes they'll have entry-level programs for students who don't technically qualify for admission to the law school program. And I went to Michigan State College of Law for law school. And at that time, we had a program in which students who didn't have necessarily a high GPA, or students who didn't necessarily have the requisite LSAT score to be admitted, could participate in a summer program before the start of law school, and their admission to the school was contingent upon where they finished in the program. And a lot of schools offer stuff like that. So I don't want people, if they really want to go to law school and then that's their dream, to be dissuaded by the fact that, oh, I can't get into any law school. I'm going to have to go to a really low-ranked law school, because there are law schools that you can get into, and they have programs for admission if you can take on a summer course. And so I think that's really important, because a lot of my classmates who went on to become excellent and top-notch attorneys if we were just looking at their LSAT score and GPA at the time that they took it, schools would be like, oh no, immediately write them off. But there are schools that value, again, those soft factors and maybe exigent circumstances that prevent you from getting the best score that you can or the GPA that you can, or maybe they recognize that you are in fact a hard worker who just has issues taking tests and things like that. And a lot of these programs go over first year law courses just so you have an extra step in when all the rest of the students come for the beginning of the school year. You're kind of on the same level playing field. And even one of my close friends was in a program like that. And what I saw was that students who were in that program actually did better than students who got higher GPAs and higher LSAT scores because they had that extra training. And so I would encourage you, if you are a person who is not happy with your score, maybe you don't have the best GPA, to seek out programs like that from your dream schools just to see if you may be able to get admitted another way.
Yeah, I think certainly anything you could do to make the first semester of law school easier is well worth pursuing, as I'm sure you could say.
Yes. Yes. So another thing we have teed up is the curve, and I have my illustration, and I can let you take a stab at it first, Steve, while I put up my illustration here, if you can see that.
Yep.
So this is, let me see. Okay, so the curve is essentially like a bell curve here, and with the standard distribution being most students are in the center. Can you see that?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, you can see that at 50%. So this is where most students average, and you can just see the cluster. And then on one side of it, you have students who are in the 75th percentile, and then I guess depending on which way you go, the higher ranked students who are in the 25% ranked percentile. And so when you go to law school, I think one thing that students should know is that everything is graded on that curve. So for example, if there are 100 students in the class, and depending on what law school you can go to, I'll just use A, B, and C. Let's say A being the highest, C being the lowest. 50% of students, according to my curve here, 50% of students are going to get a B because that's the median mid-level score. 25 people are going to get a C or below a B, like B minus.
Oh, you're on the left, so that's actually the A.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so maybe these are the A students. So if this is a B, these will be the A students, so anywhere from A minus, A plus, and then if you're on this side, 25 students are going to get from a B minus to a C. So I think that in the context of conceptualizing how law school actually works, recognize that an A, just because you got A's in college, does not necessarily mean an A. If you're in a classroom with three other people, or excuse me, if you're one of three people in a class, if you get a 97 and somebody gets a 98, all of a sudden you have a B, and that can be the hardest thing for law students to recognize. And I just wanted to throw that out there, even though that isn't LSAT related, is because when you take this LSAT, understand that you are putting yourself in a position to go into a whole new world where the rules are completely different, and that is just one of the many different rules in which you will always be compared to other people. And the LSAT is like the very first step in that, in which a 160 could be the difference between, or excuse me, a difference between a 160 and a 163 is a difference, like you mentioned, between $4,000 of you not having to pay back. And it's the same thing with actual law school grades. So be prepared to put in the work, because the 3 months that you take to study for the LSAT is the same exact 3 months that you're going to have to put in for the bar exam. And so in my opinion, I love the LSAT, and I say that with like an asterisk, but I love the LSAT because that's really a law student's first opportunity to see how much time you need to put into something, because the same amount of vigor that you have for studying for this thing is the same amount that will get you through law school, which is the same amount that will get you through the bar. And at each point, those will each be the hardest thing you've ever had to do in your life academically up until that point. So I love that about the LSAT, is because that is a very realistic way to show you how you will be judged. And if you don't have the fervor, I guess, to make it past this first point, you might not make it. But if you're a person who, like myself and like you, Steve, who are like, okay, this is not my best, but I recognize that if I put in more time, I can do it. This is the very first stop, and everything after that will just continue on, and it'll be that way into your career.
I'm really glad you brought up this idea of the curve, because I think it actually does relate to the LSAT. And the reason is that the LSAT is, as you said, it's harder than anything the typical applicant has encountered up to that point. And it's that because it's on a curve, so to speak, a raw score conversion, you're being compared against a tougher applicant pool. It's like maybe in your undergrad, maybe in high school, you were the big fish in the small pond. But now, taking the LSAT, you're with a select group of people who are academically oriented, people who are ambitious, people who are type A. And it's a more competitive pool than the people who never went anywhere after college, maybe didn't go to college, et cetera. And so in law school, it's going to be the same thing also. Tougher pool, more competition. Exactly. And so what that means is that don't be discouraged if your percentile ranking on the LSAT is not where you were for the SAT or for other exams.
Exactly.
The other thing I would add is that this also relates to choosing a law school. A lot of people want to simply go to the best law school possible, and they'll choose one ranked 30 over one ranked 40, even if the lower ranked one gives you a ton more scholarship money. And so I would encourage folks to definitely rethink that sometimes. Don't get sucked in by the rankings, because the rankings, their criteria are not necessarily your criteria. Their criteria, if you look into it, it's actually kind of absurd. Like the number of books in the library when everything is digital anyway.
The number of students that are there, the number of students who get a job, how quickly they get a job after they graduate, like other external factors that have nothing to do with the LSAT, or the college applicant play a role in U.S. News and World Report rankings. And another thing about those rankings is that a lot of the rankings can change while you're in the law school. And so, and one thing, and I wrote this on Twitter the other day, so I guess I should have had that, but the rankings, unless you go to a top 10 or 15 school, or let's just say T25, unless you go to a top ranked 25 school, you cannot use a 30 and below school to leverage a higher salary, right? So like, I'll just use my school. At the time that I applied to Michigan State, I want to say it was ranked like number 40 or something. When I graduated, it was ranked number 60. When I started applying for jobs, it was just Michigan State. Like nobody was like, oh, is this the number 60th ranking? Is this the number? Because if you go to Harvard, Georgetown, Stanford, these types of schools, then it becomes what ranking is this? But if there's a difference, a 10,000, 15,000, or any significant difference in money, tuition that you have to pay back, I would recommend that you go to whatever school offers you the most money, unless it's a really low ranked school that doesn't have the credibility, or schools that are unranked, period. Those are the only caveats to that.
Exactly. And so the nice thing, I would just to close off my thought from earlier, if you go to a lower ranked school where you can get more scholarship money, you can then also graduate with less debt, have more employment options afterwards, because you could do whatever you want without the debt. And you're also in a less competitive pool potentially at that law school. So when we talk about the curve, how you're stacked rankings relative to your peers at the school, you could then be the big fish in the small pond if you were significantly more academically inclined than your classmates. Exactly. As a bonus.
I agree. 1000%. So if you haven't already, check Steve out, check out his blog, and I will pub that and give all the information in the link below. Any final thoughts, Steve? No,
thanks for having me, Anna. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed our discussion, and we'd love to do another anytime.
Thank you for inviting me. So we will get with you soon. And again, as always, thank you for tuning in to both myself and Steve on Closet Meets Career.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.